What's the tea? Welcome everyone to Trust and Trade, your weekly glimpse into hot topics in the world of antitrust and consumer protection.
Hello, everybody. You are listening to the short podcast series sponsored by the Economics Committee with the latest highlights of our programming. Your host is Gabriela Antonie, and our guest today is Juliette Caminade. Juliette is a vice president with Analysis Group, and she specializes in the economic analysis of US and EU competition issues, worker misclassification issues, and strategy matters. She has testified as an expert witness, and she has conducted analysis of competition and antitrust issues across a range of industries with a focus on technology markets, two-sided platforms, and healthcare markets. Juliette, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me here.
So you recently hosted a brown bag on the basic economics of two-sided platforms. Can you walk us through the economic definition of a two-sided platform?
Yes. So economists started talking about two-sided platforms in the early 2000s with French economists. Since then, the definitions that have been used by economists have been substantially similar. So you can think of a two-sided platform as a business which serves as an intermediary between two groups of users, specifically facilitating their interactions. And each side affects the value of the platform for users on the other side. That's what economists call indirect network effects. What that means is that a two-sided platform provides services to each group, and that it can provide services only to one side. It needs both sides to exist.
And two-sided platforms seem to be all the hype in antitrust lately. Are they a new phenomenon? How do they matter for antitrust?
Yeah, so two-sided platforms are not a new business models. Like think about American Express or malls, or even in the Middle Ages, you had champagne fairs that were effectively two-sided platform. But in the last 10, 15 years, with the emergence and diffusion of new technology, there's been an explosion in the number of digital two-sided platforms. Why does this matter for antitrust? That's because there are fundamental differences between two-sided platforms and more traditional one-sided businesses. And those differences have implications for antitrust analyses.
So what are these differences? Can you walk us through a practical way to distinguish two-sided platforms from traditional one-sided businesses?
Yeah, so there's this test, this three-part test that I personally find helpful in terms of defining two-sided platforms. So this test go back to the three defining features of two-sided platforms. The first one is, are there two groups of customers? The second one is, does the platform facilitate their interactions? And the third one is, are there indirect network effects that are at the core of the business model of that business? And unfortunately, there's no bright line test, as Mark Reisman noted. Virtually all markets might be two-sided to some extent. And actually, to make matters even more difficult, two-sided platforms may also offer one-sided features. For instance, OpenTable offers table management services. And indirect network effects are not a binary concept, they fall on a continuum. But that's why for me, going back to this three-part test is a really helpful way of distinguishing two-sided platforms from one-sided businesses.
That sounds complicated, so I suggest to start with the basics. What would be some examples of common two-sided platform?
So let me go through some examples that I'm sure all of you have heard about or have used probably. So one are ride-sharing apps that facilitate interactions between drivers and riders and have strong indirect network effects. You also have things like restaurant reservation platforms that put in touch restaurants and diners, vacation rental platforms that put in touch host and guest, or an older example that's not digital that put in touch farmers and shoppers.
And how do two-sided platforms create value?
So a two-sided platform acts as a matchmaker for users of the two groups. It facilitates and encourages their interactions, and the way it does so is by reducing search and transaction costs. The way you can think about search costs is those costs that are incurred by buyers and sellers to find each other. So for instance, if you think about a ride-sharing app, that's the cost that riders and drivers need to incur to find each other. And then you also have transaction costs, which are those costs that are incurred after the users on the two sides have found each other and want to transact. So for instance, ride-sharing app, they reduce transaction costs by offering a seamless payment, and that's a reduction in transaction cost. And the way the platform makes money is that they capture a portion of the value generated by the interactions.
Anytime we talk about two-sided platforms, we invariably end up discussing indirect network effects, which you already previewed. Can you discuss what these are and why they are important?
Yes, that's you're absolutely right. They are at the core of the definition of a platform, those indirect network effects. But what are they really? Before saying more, I just want to quickly take a step back and define a few economic concepts to avoid any confusion. So there's this concept of standalone benefits. What those are is they're benefits received by a customer, even if nobody else is using the product. So for instance, if I buy a bottle of soda, I drink it, and that's a standalone benefit of the bottle of soda. Now there's also direct network benefits. So those are when you have a platform, but the benefits are coming from interacting with users that are similar to you. So for instance, a good example will be WhatsApp, right? I want to send messages to my friends. I have a bunch of friends on WhatsApp, and those are direct network benefits. In this case, the larger is the own network, the more value the customers have, but from interacting with people from the same type as them. And that's a difference with indirect network benefits, which are the benefits that are received by a customer on one side of the platform, and those benefits are received from interacting with users on the other side. So that's a difference with the direct network benefits. So at the core of a two-sided platform, you have those indirect network benefits. And typically, those grow the more users you have on the other side. And that's what we usually call the indirect network effects.
Interesting. So can you provide some examples of how indirect network effects arise in a real-world context?
Yes, I think that's super useful because indirect network effect is a bit of a cryptic term. And so really making it tangible is going to be important. So let me give you some examples. Let's think about credit cards because it's an example that's often used in this context. So one way that you see those indirect network effect is that a shopper, so like you and me, we would find a credit card more useful to us if more merchants accept it. And on the other side, a merchant would value being part of a payment network more if more shoppers hold the cards that are from that network. For example, that I personally find very helpful, one of ride-sharing apps. At their core, what they do is they make it easier for drivers and riders to find each other and to transact. A rider will value a ride-sharing app more when there are more drivers on the platform. It's faster. And vice versa, the drivers value a ride-sharing app if there are more riders on the platform because they would be able to provide more rides per hour because they will get a ride faster and then they will need to drive less to pick them up.
This reminds me of another basic economic concept, economies of scale. So how are the two different, if at all?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Gabriela, because those are often confused, but there's some similarities, but they're also quite different in a way that matters for antitrust analyses. Indirect network effects are demand side effects. The users are those that value the platform more when there are more users on the other side. And the platform might be able to benefit, but only if it's able to capture some of that increased surplus that comes from a higher value from the users. On the other end, indirect network effects are supply side effects. What they are is that when I'm a company and I produce more of whatever I'm producing, it costs me less. So there's lower cost per unit or per customer. And that benefits the firm. And customers might benefit, but only if the business decides to pass the lower costs through to them.
Super interesting. And I know that indirect network effects are actually often discussed in the context of barriers to entry. So can you discuss a little bit how indirect network effects change the calculus for determining market power?
Yeah, that's been a really hot topic, specifically about two-sided platforms. And let me preview this by saying, don't laugh because economists always say that there's a wide difference of opinions on this topic. So early on, economists thought that network effects combined with high switching cost would create strong barriers to entry, which of course that would be a concern for regulators. Recently, there's been some more nuanced views that have been emerging. So for instance, I'm going to cite economists Andre Hagiu and Julian Wright, who've been writing a lot about two-sided platform. So what they say is there is huge variance in how strong network effects are, and that ultimately determines whether or not they create a defensible moat. Economist Catherine Tucker has also written about how multi-homing limits the power of network effects. What is multi-homing? That's when users have ready access to competing platforms like at the same time. So for instance, I might have both the Uber and the Lyft app on my phone. And so when I'm looking for a ride, I can quickly check the price on both apps. And so both of them, there's different strength of network effects, and there's also multi-homing, and that can really limit the barriers to entry. So there's also this point that in many cases, switching costs can actually be quite low. And there's also another interesting point that Catherine Tucker has highlighted is that upfront costs for digital platforms have been lowered through different technologies like the cloud. And that facilitates entry by making it much easier to get a competing platform up and running. And so, like with so many things with economists, the answer to whether an incumbent platform can foreclose entry is it depends.
The answer is always it depends. And returning to the point that you made about the increasing ease of launching new digital platforms, how does such a dynamic and fast-changing landscape influence how you go about assessing competitive impacts?
First off, it's important to remember that indirect network effects work both ways. Not only can they drive the fast rise of a platform, but they can also lead to just as fast as a decline for an incumbent. This accelerated rate of change may call into questions the relevance of market shares for measuring dominance, and also into the acquisitions of nascent or potential competitors. So I think it's making it harder to analyze competitive effects because, traditional metrics sometimes in the short term, they may exist in the short term, but they may not be as predictive as a medium-term competitive landscape. But, I think it's good that dynamism is good for competition. So that's a bright side here.
Switching topics slightly, one of the defining moments for the current state of the antitrust litigation was the Supreme Court's 2018 ruling in the Amex case, a favorite topic for economists. What were the key takeaways from that ruling? And in your opinion, what is the legacy of the decision?
The Amex legacy primarily influences ongoing debates over market definition, but sometimes others. The Supreme Court decision included, in my opinion, two key points. One is that both sides of a two-sided transaction platform must be considered at the same time, and only other two-sided transaction platforms are competitors. So, in my opinion, it's been great that the court has been recognizing the specificities of two-sided platform, but the decision has also generated much debate among antitrust practitioners. So one of the first questions here is that you might have heard a slight difference here, is that the Amex decision is about two-sided transaction platforms. So the first question is, what are those? At least from an economist perspective, it's hasn't really been a well-established concept. So that's one. And the second point too is some economists have raised concerns about an overly narrow approach to market definition, meaning this idea that you need to consider the two sides at the same time and jointly in the market definition, and that such a narrow approach might ignore commercial realities. And yeah, it's been a really hot topic, a lot of debate here.
And another issue central to the Amex decision was that merchants were being charged what they alleged were anti-competitive fees, while credit card users were not, and in fact could receive rewards for using their Amex card. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah. So what's interesting here is that this asymmetric pricing that you highlighted in your question, that is a lot of two-sided platforms use such asymmetric pricing. Why is that the case? That's because, well, two-sided platforms have two sides. And so very often you might have multiple prices for each price. And you also have this concept that economists have highlighted is that you might need to have a pricing structure that's designed to promote transactions on the platform. And so you don't always want to focus on one side or the other. And what has happened here is that you have some pricing structure where one side of the platform doesn't pay anything, or they may even be subsidized for using the platform. If you think about the case of rewards, like for OpenTable, OpenTable, they charge fees to restaurants, but diners can use it for free, and they can even have rewards when they make certain type of reservations. Or similarly, ad-supported platforms like Facebook or TikTok or Google, they provide free content and services to one set of users to attract advertisers on the other side. So what's really interesting here is that such pricing asymmetry does raise challenging questions in an antitrust context. For instance, if you have multiple prices, you might have multiple measures of competition for each side, and that can get complicated. And something that I also find really interesting too is that in those digital platforms, current or near-term profitability may not be a primary competitive driver. So if you think about ride-sharing platforms, when they started, they really wanted to get enough riders and drivers on each side. And so they really heavily subsidized each side to attract enough riders and drivers to really get those indirect network effects to fire up. And so what that means is that it can be tricky to use pricing as a proxy for competitive pressure, because you need to think first about the two sides of the platform, and two, where are you in the life cycle of the platform, and are you in the subsidy phase of the platform or not?
Juliette, so all this, what does it all mean for the current state of regulatory review and litigation?
I think the bottom line here is that traditional tools and approaches for measuring competitive effects are slightly less straightforward to apply to digital platforms because of those indirect network effects and those different sets of users. There is a potential competitive effects for the ad issue behavior that may differ for each side. So that might make the analysis more complicated. Additionally, pricing and sales practices that may raise anti-competitive concerns for traditional one-sided firms may actually have some pro-competitive effects in case of two-sided platforms. So we don't have time to go into the details here, but you can think about below marginal cost pricing, also things like exclusivity clauses. And ultimately, market power is difficult to capture with usual measures of market share, prices, and markup, because you have this issue of analysis of two-sided platforms with zero price services on one side. That's more complex. And you also have competition for the free side of the platform with non-financial attributes, such as quality of innovation. So again, it's just a bit more complicated.
Fascinating topic. And thank you, Juliette, for simplifying the complexities of two-sided platforms. And thanks for everybody who has tuned in for our podcast. We hope to see you all next time. Thanks, Juliette, again.
Thank you, Gabriela.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Trust in Trade, brought to you as always by the Antitrust Law Section of the American Bar Association. Now you know that's the T.